Yeah. Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. It's the first time I'm at this university. It's a great honor to be here, and it's very nice to be here. This is actually not the first time I'm in Namibia. The first time I was in Namibia was over 20 years ago. What I will speak now very, very briefly on is conceptual modeling for planning and decision making. And it's an approach that we've been using at BTH and that I use at my former university, Stockholm University. I'll give you a quick run through about its potential use and usefulness with some case examples. And this is, of course, nothing new, but it needs to be emphasized that in planning, which is by definition for the future, you actually need to understand the problem in order to design working solutions. And the honest answer is that most of us, when we come up with solutions, don't really bother about finding out how things work. And that is a huge problem. Historically, I would say, if we talk about environmental issues, the first generation of issues, the big debate was really whether or not we had an issue at all. Are pesticides damaging nature, etc.? Second generation issues, we often had to handle more difficult multiple factor causation and things more complicated than we thought originally. I would argue that what we are faced with today, our current challenges, we have to embrace complexity. Society is complex, environmental and planning issues are complex, and this complexity in itself is a problem. Because if we fiddle around with these systems without knowing how they actually work and their feedbacks, we are likely to actually create even more issues. And I would also argue that old rules of the thumb are less suited to our current conditions. Currently, the world is in rapid change, and that goes for many interacting aspects. We are facing seismic shifts in world economy, energy technology and use, technology in general. We have demographic development. We have a global run on resources, which are getting scarcer and scarcer in some respects. There are ongoing climate change with all the attendant environmental, societal, and economic and security challenges connected to these issues. These contextual environmental factors that traditionally planners and policymakers could regard as almost quasi-constant, and when you analyze the problem, you just change one factor. When you discard it. Currently, this will not work so well. There is actually no possibility to assess the interplay of so many factors unless you start working and thinking in systems and modeling terms. And what can we say about complex problems? I would argue that you experience the problems via symptoms. A symptom is something you don't like in this case. So you are not seeing the problem. You rather see the symptoms because to understand problems, we need to understand the behavior of the more complex system. So the problem is actually in the system, not what we actually often talk about. And what characterizes these complex problems? As I said, it's often hard to understand their cause. Problems are rarely solved by a single decision, action, or intervention. And actually, what we thought was the solution, in many cases, increased the negative impacts caused by the new action. And that's a little bit like having a mechanical watch that doesn't show the correct time and just opening it up and fiddling around with it and hope that we will improve things. So we don't really understand the system. So how can we then handle complex issues and complexity? We need some sort of toolbox or approach to disentangle complexity. And as I said, complexity often causes unexpected dynamics and unintentional outcomes, and not thinking through creates unnecessary cost and bad outcomes. So what are the tools? How do we create order out of a confusing complexity? So let's start. As it asks here on the slide, which actually cuts off a bit, can you understand the function of a bicycle by studying all its component parts? Do we need all the details? The system is actually more, and in some respects, less than the component parts. We don't need to know the importance of any little washer or screw and bolt here. So we need to simplify to understand. And the whole idea with the model is to simplify complexity. We actually offer some detail in order to gain understanding. So system thinking could also add that how we understand the bicycle actually depend on the questions we ask. And our approach is to do what is often called system thinking. And that is, I would say, done with advantage involving many different competencies, many stakeholders and actors, because it's very rare that one individual actually has the overview needed. And you need to approach this from several different perspectives. The point of view that simple solutions are rarely correct. Everybody loves a simple solution. Researchers, politicians, everybody wants a simple answer to a complex challenge. Also requires an attitude that you can actually do this. You can solve and actually understand the complexity that in many cases nobody has really got a good record. And it also requires an openness for the argument from other stakeholders, other disciplines. And finally, it requires a will to communicate. And when I speak about models, sometimes people get a bit defensive, things about complex mathematics and difficult things, or that you cannot, force things into systems and models. I would argue on the extreme that we only understand our world with models. Basically, we work with them every day. We've got descriptive models that could be images, illustration, it could be prose, it could be poetry. And we've got correlative models that actually shows how something appears to be related to something else. And we've got mechanistic models. And we've got two types. We've got qualitative models who answer the question, why and how? But there's no intrinsic conflict between qualitative models and quantitative models. We need to start with a qualitative understanding. The quantitative model can answer questions like when and how much. But basically, we all work with simplifications. And which simplifications we can accept depends on the question we ask and the quality of the answer we want. And some details will be wrong. It may not matter. Now, if you were to choose tasty, ripe tomato, going into the shop to pick it, what would be your criteria for picking the right sort of tasty tomato? Someone?
Nice looking.
Nice looking. What does it look like?
It's red.
Dark red. Other tips?
Are you picking?
How
How many are you picking?
Well, it doesn't matter. You can pick as many as you like. I would look at how big it is, how it smells, perhaps. If it's very soft or too hard. I mean, is it just the type?
Yes, if allowed to sample a drop of the sap, to squeeze it onto a refractometer and look at the rings reading.
That would be one way of doing it. That's one way of doing it. You pick the red, not too hard, not too soft, nicely tasting tomato, which you then test in your sampler. That's hopefully not too destructive. And then you come up with reasonable chance of a good pick. That's your model. But you know that there are yellow tomatoes, there are brownish red tomatoes, and green tomatoes. But you all picked a model that will give you the right answer in perhaps 90% of the cases. It's not a perfect model, but it answers your question. And that in itself is an important insight. You don't want to answer everything, you want to answer your question with a sufficient precision. And we use models also to communicate our understanding of complex systems and problems. We use it to create mental maps of our problems and issues, and also to facilitate critique in order to improve our understanding of the world, and not the least to support the important from the unimportant. Now, here we have the tomato. So to do modeling, you have to start with your question, you have to pose a relevant follow-up question, and you have perhaps to rephrase your question to actually catch what you're really after. And then you have to think about how does things connect, and very importantly, what causes what. We want to make causal links in our model. And in doing these conceptual modeling, we use something that is called causal loop diagrams, or shortened CLDs. And CLDs are a simplification of a complex problem. The CLDs help us to structure and understand major relationships and linked causalities. It is something we use to understand cause and effect. It also gives an explanation for underlying feedbacks, which is something we often forget. It's something that also helps us to understand system behavior. And it constitutes actually a common language that helps us describe the system logic. And it also facilitates others to scrutinize and improve our model. And I should add, really should have been down here, that it also provides us with a map of alternative intervention points to change the system behavior. That is, to change the outcome in the direction we want. That is the leverage point. In doing these types of models, the best thing we need is huge whiteboards or paper. Never do them on the computer because you love your tentative models too much. You need to scrap a lot of things. And basically we do it with arrows, pluses and minuses, and words. And the plus, and this is the tricky thing in the beginning here, shows the change. So if you have something here that results in something else, the plus denotes that the input, if it's more of the input, you will have more of the same as an output. Alternative. You have less of something as an input, you will have less of the outputs. The plus actually denotes the direction of the change. Similar direction of the input to the output. And conversely, a minus denotes that if you have more of something here, you will have less in the output, or vice versa. That is the tricky thing that everybody makes mistakes about in the beginning. And I recommend that when you scrutinize your models, you actually speak loud to yourself. In principle, there are two system behaviors. Either things are if we have feedbacks reinforcing, or they are balancing. Can't be both, it's either or. And to illustrate how we actually make a simple model, let's say that we have a population. The population generates births. The larger the population, the more births, hence the plus. More births results in a larger population. And the larger population in turn creates more births. Right? How will that population behave? It will increase exponentially. Now, if we add deaths, let's say from old age, whatever, you could say that the larger the populations, with some time, the larger the number of deaths. And the larger the number of deaths, the smaller population. That's a minus. That means that in the end, you would have a system which actually behaves like that. You would have an increase in population, and after a while, as this was old age death, the death will level out the population. And this is true for males and people. It's a universal sort of model. And by actually setting up these type of linkages and concepts, you can in principle map and model anything qualitatively. I have colleagues who's been doing this on medical problems, on economy, or anything. And also models don't need to be very complex to be analytically valuable. Actually, there's a strength in working with as simple models as you can to answer your question. Then I really would like to say something about group modeling, which I think is extremely useful in the planning context. Almost any context, but definitely in planning, where you want participatory planning, you want to go beyond simple consultation with stakeholders and actually involve them. We have been doing this with groups. We have been pretty unique in doing it also with extremely large groups, something like 60 or 70 people at one go. And it works very nicely, and it has some nice outcomes. It creates a common language between the stakeholders. You can include a very broad expertise and different stakeholders. We have done this with civil servants from government agencies and reindeer herders with 9 years schooling. You can mix lay knowledge with academic knowledge. That works nicely. It helps also the stakeholders to visualize their mental models and understanding. Can identify knowledge gaps. And you, in our experience, will reach a workable consensus. Not a consensus about outcomes, but a consensus about how things actually work. And a lot of conflict between stakeholders is driven by the fact that they don't feel heard or are not listened to. Now, this allows us actually to bring in their understanding, their aspects, and their interest into the model. And then our experience is that all stakeholders actually can accept different outcomes from a planning process, but they want their experience and situation actually to be included. So we can go beyond simple controversies towards more solutions. We've had stakeholders who otherwise only meet in court, sitting down and doing models. So it's extremely conflict reduced. We can test hypotheses and reject the uses. The stakeholders and the people who are engaged in group modeling are actually doing peer review on the model as they go. Does this actually occur? Is this causing that? Is there a feedback? Which way does it go? And it unblocks prestige and it becomes very solution oriented. Our experience is once again that stakeholders forget their conflicts, sit down and actually try to hammer out how things work. It's like, a computer game. How does this work? Does this link this way? Or did it go through that action and result in this? When we have been doing group modeling sessions, we've started with a question, of course. We've had different communities. It could be academics, it could be researchers, it could be different stakeholder groups. And they work and develop a model at the first iteration. We also include testing, and we have to facilitate it and see that things work. Then typically we would end the day with a first draft of a model. Stakeholders would go home for about a month or so. We would tidy up their models, not change them, email it to all the stakeholders. They can test it on their constituencies or whatever. We will get feedback, suggestions for revisions. We will tidy up obvious errors. And the next meeting a month later, we will go through the model, the suggested improvements, the errors we thought we observed, and so on, full transparency. And then the group will continue to develop models or answer new questions. And after at least 3 sessions, requires 3 or 4 sessions in our experience, they usually will come up with a solution to the complex problem they worked with. A number of iterations, full openness, and openness to others' argument. I will give you some examples now of how we've been deploying this. This is an example of a student project in a municipality close to Stockholm. The aim of the project was to identify and include ecosystem services in planning. There's a great challenge, as a student put it, to plan for more houses and an efficient infrastructure, while at the same time keep the green structure and its ecosystem services and reduce the risk for climate change. So the students did this type of modeling with planners and stakeholders involving also themselves, could then run through the problem and actually identify that there's a great risk that the more development you have in the municipality, the more economic activity you will have, and that will drive this regional development, and that will eventually reduce the attractiveness of the population, with the risk of less growth in the municipality. And the actual solution here was to realize that you risk losing natural and cultural values, and the larger that risk is, the more there will be a need for environmental provisions, and the more there will be a need for that, there will be more inclusion of environmental aspects of planning, which is also driven by climate change. With this more inclusion of environmental services in planning will result in actually more delivery of ecosystem services. And that will actually help and drive a more sustainable municipality. This type of model made a huge impact in actually the municipality's planning, to the extent that they actually hired one of our students for a permanent job. Like that. We also had a fairly large project for the Swedish EPA. The Swedish EPA were to revise and modify their work on environmental objectives. We got a whole list of parliamentary national environmental objectives with indicators and stuff. There was an unhappiness at the Swedish EPA with current indicators and also lack of progress towards the environmental objectives. So they asked us to do a study on that, and our mission was to analyze the objectives with the magnificent mountains up north in Sweden as an example. We were to analyze conflicts, administration and management, make an analysis of the future, and actually propose a research program. And instead of doing that as a scientist only or inviting other scientists, we included ourselves, other scientists, but above all, a huge number of stakeholders and actors. And the process was, as I said, it was group modeling. We did a literature review, we did stakeholder queries, we brought in other researchers in the mountains, and we had neighbor dialogue. But the most important thing was the group modeling. This is not a complete list of participants, but it includes NGOs, research organizations, an NGO, nature conservation, regional government of various kinds, the Organization for Swedish Farmers, the Swedish Farming Board, Swedish Defense, State Board for Real Estate, Society and NGO for extremely small scale farmers and crofters, energy agencies, ecotourism associations, various municipalities, yet another whole list of government and regional actors, national police, the Sami Parliament, which is a reindeer herding indigenous minority working up there with reindeer herding, Swedish Geological Survey, Swedish Tourist Association, and a whole lot of other actors. And some of these people really were hugely distrustful between themselves. So let's start doing modeling on how various interests function. Tourism, or for this matter, reindeer herding. Reindeer herders actually wanted us to help them develop a strategy for their future because they could see huge problems with climate change and things like that. And then we came up with these type of models, which we then could fit into larger models. And in the end, all 65 or 70 stakeholders ended up agreeing on a couple of models of how the mountains worked. Full consensus. Huge differences in the outcomes they wanted, but there was no conflict about how wind power impacted on reindeer herding or more tourism impacted on wind power or mining. And that reduced conflict because nobody tried to erase various actors' experiences, the impact. And they all felt extreme ownership for the results. And some of the results were, for the Swedish EPA, a bit unexpected and not necessarily immediately positive. One was that poor environmental object delivery was actually caused by too much of an environmental focus and a failure to include other aspects of sustainability on the social scale or the economic scale. So poor environmental delivery because they only focus on the environment. As a follow-up, we had to look on indicators for environmental objectives. And as a good indicator should be relevant, robust, and reliable. That's obvious, everybody knows that. It should also be available or collectible. It should be available and collectible in a cost-efficient manner. It should also, we argue, be easy to communicate and understand, and it should fit within a system's framework, because then you understand the impact of a change in the indicator. And ideally, it should also give early warning for policy adjustment. Turned out that the current indicators supposed to be used by the Swedish EPA had no real benchmarks, no defined targets that related to policy response. And they were not spatially disaggregated, and it turned out that they were not even used. Huge effort was included in collecting stuff, but not really using it. And the objective of the mountains as a graced, magnificent landscape with huge continuous area shall be retained was indicated by the number of reindeers in the whole of the mountain area. Almost half of Sweden. A fourth of Namibia, one indicator. Not geographical, it is aggregated. And with no target level. It swings enormously. Doesn't help anyone, doesn't help the local government, doesn't help the Sami reindeer herders. So we needed something else. And of course, the number of reindeers is dependent on the number of predators. More predators, more reindeers, you can have more predators because they feed on the reindeers, and more predators reduces the number of reindeers. Winter grazing is likewise critical, and so is summer grazing. So in order to have sensible indicators of whether or not we can keep this objective, we need to include these other aspects, currently not really included very well. And we might even need indicators on things like bush and tree encroachment caused by climate change, the amount of older trees affected by intense forestry, because that affects winter grazing. And of course, irreversible exploitation that affects the amount of grazing land available. So these things grow, but so does our understanding of the system. And the needed indicators, according to us and the stakeholders, was, first of all, number of predators, summer grazing, bush and tree encroachment, winter grazing, trends for old forests, trends for irreversible exploitation, at, this is important, at the actor-relevant spatial scale. If we want to have delivery of the environmental objectives, the actors must have indicators that are relevant for the action, especially as policy-wise. Swedish government assumes that all actors will do the sensible thing and take responsibility. If you can't disaggregate it to your activity, you are having problems. Same goes for, let's say, mineral exploitation. Just measuring the surface of the exploitation doesn't really catch the impact to begin with, and you would really like to have something that indicates what's going on in the system. Turned out that the gold price was a very good proxy for increased surveying from mining interests that would give us an early warning signal. So if we want to discuss how much mining we want in the Swedish mountains and the impacts on, let's say, Sami, reindeer herding, and the environment of wilderness in general, we could get early warning by actually doing a systematic monitoring of something as simple and readily available as the gold price. Also, turns out that when you actually do some GIS studies on this and look at the impact on the supposedly unimpacted wilderness cores that shouldn't be impacted at all. Turns out that the already existing exploitation has a huge impact and it's likely to grow. You need relevant indicators. I will end with a similar study combining modeling, conceptual modeling and GIS, and that was a study on the potential of concentrated solar power, something that is very relevant for Namibia. And I suppose that some of you are familiar with the Desertec project, was a project proposed to actually emplace a lot of CSP facilities in the Sahara, actually to then deliver power to Europe. And the argument was that Sahara is huge, there's an unlimited amount of sunshine, there's a huge desert, and there's very few interests that would argue against this. We can basically put up this stuff wherever we want. Sounds intuitively reasonable, but once you do CLD modeling and GIS analysis on it, turns out that we use Western Australia as a proxy for Sahara because we've got better high-resolution data on infrastructure, climate, water availability, and the like. Turns out that, and this is largely desert, seems just as in Sahara that we have a wonderful opportunity to put in CSP basically wherever we want, and this should be an extremely interesting area. This was the outcome. Black is totally excluded areas, national parks, high risk of storms, and things like that. The blue is less suited areas owing to long distance from roads, water availability, things like this. The yellow and orange is really the area that are suited from sort of a physical, geographical, and economic point of view. This was done by a master student of mine, and we actually published it together in Energy Policy. And the slightly, initially, depressing result was that 99.4% of this apparently suitable area was useless. 99.4% was in practice unavailable for various technical, practical, economic reasons. That seemed very depressing. But the positive result from Lucas and my study was that the remaining 0.5% was more than enough for the use for the mining industry, general electrification, and the power requirements of this area. So 0.5% was more than sufficient, amply sufficient. But it just shows that actually doing these sort of homework, identifying the feedbacks, understanding how the system works, can be vitally important to actually come up with good planning and workable policies. With that, I think I'm done. Thank you very much.
Professor, thank you very much. I think it was very insightful and interesting. I personally learned a lot. I'm sure many of us did. I would like to open the floor for questions, first in the room, and then later on you can also ask the people online. Anybody? If there are no questions, you guys have a little bit of time to think of it. You will come with questions. I do actually have a question. In the beginning, you said something about conceptual modeling. You know, you need to understand the problem. And I was wondering, to what extent do you need to understand the context? Like more from a social perspective, for instance, to understand the context. You come now here, you've been here many times, so you understand our context quite a lot. But how much do you really need to understand? Because we do work a lot with international consortia to really understand what's happening on the ground to do a successful model.
Well, I think that's the whole point. You need to understand context. You need to include a social context. And that is really the argument to include stakeholders. I would say that there's, as we all know, a lot of talk about, having a holistic perspective, doing transdisciplinary research involving stakeholders, even in defining the questions to be answered. But there's usually very little thought on which methodology do you want to integrate this? How do you make the stakeholder actually communicate with the planner or the scientist? How do they communicate and how do they come up with an analysis of problems, potential solutions, feedbacks in the system? And this approach is totally agnostic. You can do it on any problem. And it's quite easy actually to include the social aspects as well.
Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. I was following with keen interest because I also have something to do with systems dynamic modeling. Is it possible to combine both quantitative and qualitative inputs into the modeling? Considering that if you are talking about the social aspect, most of the time it might be qualitative, and then from a GIS perspective, you are talking about numbers. So are you able to combine the two separate data sets into a system dynamic modeling and probably have an output that answers both the quantitative and qualitative questions? Thank you.
That is a very good question. The answer is both yes and no. To start doing a quantitative model, you need to have qualitative understanding. So I would argue that the conceptual model is actually your blueprint for whatever you are doing as numerical modeling or GIS. That's the first thing. Then I agree with your implicit comment here that in some cases you can't get numbers on some of the qualitative things, or it's very difficult to get. You may have then an idea of how a response function may look like. That may in some cases be good enough to understand the dynamics. That is definitely a challenge. But having said that, many of these problems don't require numerical modeling. Some do, and some can benefit. It takes a lot longer time to do numerical modeling and set it up. But in our experience, in many situations, you can solve real-world serious problems or conflicts by a purely qualitative model. We were asked to do this in a field that was really not our academic field, namely in public procurement, which was the most conflict-laden area of procurement in Sweden. 30%, no, almost 50%, if I remember correctly, of all deals ended up in court. So let's say 40%, an enormous level of conflict. Nobody understood why. So we brought in stakeholders from food producers, the monopolists in the food sector, people cooking food in schools, dietitians, politicians, around 30 people from government agencies. And we started the same process of doing a model, met once a month, and in the end, the stakeholders came up and identified the conflict problem as well as the solution. Only required a qualitative understanding. But having said that, what you are lifting there as an issue is definitely an issue. You can't get numbers of everything, and then you, of course, can't do numerical simulation. On the other hand, there are pretty useful software to help you do numerical simulation if you've got an understanding of the numbers involved.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor, for the insightful presentation. Mine is more of a practical sort of question in terms of how long does it take usually when you're dealing with this multidisciplinary, multi-sectoral sort of stakeholders to actually get to a consensus and like start to agree on a challenge. I'm asking that because in my project, I'm looking at the water, energy, food nexus, and I would like to actually bring all the stakeholders together, but I also want to look at the feasibility of that within the time frame that's actually given. Well, so how long does it take to sort of bring people together?
I think we'll need a couple of meetings with some time in between. We experience-wise would say 3 to 4 meetings and some time for the stakeholders to think in between. And basically what you are doing as a facilitator is introducing them in the terminology and notation. And what many of our stakeholders have said during the process is that this is a very useful and powerful tool for their own business or strategy or planning development. So this is actually a short course for them, which in most cases they find very useful. But I would say that it's definitely doable. Depends on how much time you've got left on your program. But it's a very simple and very powerful tool to disentangle complex stuff. And in our experience, all stakeholders after a while, doesn't matter their educational level really, will be able to read, criticize and improve models just as they read a newspaper after a while. It's not very complicated.
Maybe another question in addition to this question from my side. So what I understand from one of the examples is that you put a whole stakeholder group together in one room. Now, I could imagine that you also would like to work with certain stakeholder groups separate first. You know, I think there's a model where you can work with that group, they do their modeling, then you bring it together, or you mix them all up. Can you maybe say something about the usefulness of those things?
If you work with a group of 60, you have to break it out in small breakup groups. And you need to do this physically. It doesn't work to do it on Zoom, for example. And you would really need a huge amount of whiteboards or something that you can quickly redraw, adjust your terminology and stuff. If you are doing this in smaller groups, I would like to have different stakeholders in each group. I don't want people with the same background or the same interest, because then they will just reinforce their preconceived ideas, hammer in their nails of their, whatever ideas they arrive with. I would say that the best models, the best peer review you get is if you actually have people with some degree of conflict or different interests. And that is, by the way, one of the ways actually to get people to come. If you bring in their opponents, can they dare not to be in the room and affect the outcome? So conflict is in a sense good here. And our experience is invariably that conflict levels are reduced, mutual understanding is increased, but people may still have different agendas. And that's perfectly legitimate, of course.
Great. So I understand you don't do a food group and a water group and an energy group. You mix it.
Yeah.
And I'm now suddenly realizing that actually this is not about concept modeling. This is actually a lecture about conflict management on a high level. So
I would definitely agree.
Actually, we can bring you in when we have conflicts.
Well, I could say, talking about conflict, I've been using this in other settings. I've been using it, for example, in the departmental setting and devising strategy for a research group and actually doing modeling on ourselves and the way we work within the department actually improved our decision making.
Any other questions from the floor? Yes.
Have you ever tried this in the participatory community approach when doing an impact assessment?
But I would say that the thing we did in the mountains was actually involving all the local communities, including communities with very disparate resources, both academically, economically, and from a purely political power point. And I should add perhaps more emphatically that also one of our experiences is that this approach tends to empower the weakest. They can put forward their view much more efficiently. I don't know if we have time for an example, but I think the best example I've experienced was actually some of the herders we work with up in the mountains, small-scale farmers who were very concerned about predators. And of course, the national policy is to improve conditions for predators and have more wolves and bears and things. And these stakeholders with multi-water application came up with the comment that yes, but I think it's a problem from the environment point of view that you don't include the predators because they are not necessarily good for biodiversity, and we are very concerned. And quite literally, a civil servant from the EPA stood up, stomped on the floor and said, you know, predators are good for biodiversity. More carcasses creates more opportunities for birds of prey or scavengers. Then this stakeholder, now proficient in doing these type of diagrams, went up and said, yes, it's true. More predators creates more carcasses, which is good for biodiversity. On the other hand, more predators means more damage to our cows and sheep. We lose money on this, but we're also very concerned because we love our animals. That makes us less willing to continue with this type of economically marginal activity, and less small-scale farming means less haymaking and less grazing. And according to your own report, there is 250 vascular plants that actually requires grazing and haymaking. So could we now please have a more sensible discussion about the level of predators we want, because otherwise you would lose 250 species. That also affects biodiversity. And of course, the EPA was, had nothing to add. And I think this illustrates the strength of this, that it's so easy for anyone to just approach the world with your various cyclopic sort of limited perspective. Because the EPA, of course, one branch of it wanted more predators, another branch of the EPA wanted more vascular plants. But they haven't brought this whole puzzle together. And I think this is actually the strength of this approach, that you get a more complete view. It doesn't necessarily solve fundamental conflicts, but you make potentially wiser decisions.
Thanks. Just quickly want to check for the people online if they have questions. If so, they can raise their hands, then we can see it. In the meantime, I was quite intrigued about the picture of the bicycle. You said, look, we don't need all the parts to understand this is a bike. And, at the same time, you were saying a model, we see reality in a certain way. It's our way of seeing reality, like with the tomato. Now, I was wondering, does it ever happen that the nut of the bike that nobody sees actually is the critical element? So if you have your conceptualization, your modeling, and all the stuff are together, and everybody agrees, then it's like, okay, but something is missing. But you find out, and how do you deal with that?
Well, you can't deal with it. If you don't know it's missing, you don't know that.
You have to go back into,
well, it's a little bit like the known unknown and the unknown unknown.
Then the model doesn't work, basically.
Yes, but I would say that the larger stakeholder group you have, the more you reduce the likelihood of missing the vital things. And I would actually rephrase or give you a question back. What is the alternative? You cannot understand the full complexity because it's by definition too complex. The whole idea of any model, a manual or whatever, is to reduce complexity to make us actually function quicker. And if you're having problems in that you don't understand even elementary feedbacks, it's better coming up with a model that captures the main parts of the system. There may, of course, be a risk that you miss a vital part, but you still got a better understanding. And also doing models is a wonderful way of doing an audit on your knowledge gaps, because you will end up with questions, does this really link this way, or does it link another way, or are there steps in between that I need to understand? So it's a very good way of actually auditing the lacuna of knowledge. I mean, what do I really have to supplement my understanding with, either through reading or speaking with somebody or including. But no, it cannot do magic. What you don't know, you don't know.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, to be honest, my answer to your question was I would walk or use the car, but I don't think it's really a relevant answer on this. Any other questions from the floor? Is there online anybody? No? Yes, Philip?
I'm interested in, I mean, you said that it works with people at any sort of knowledge level, right? Well, perhaps I'm not also fully familiar with the situation in Sweden, but for example, in Namibia, you know, perhaps discrepancies between educational levels can be quite enormous. So I'm just wondering if you think, I mean, if you could expand a little bit on that, like how, for example, in practice working with communities, like were there measures necessary to bridge, you know, language, understanding, any sort of thing in these settings working?
You know, in practice, I would say that it works through the collective period. I mean, if you go to the Swedish debate, I mean, people installing wind power would argue that it's no problem for the reindeers and the reindeer herders. It's perfectly okay. But once you have this reindeer herder with just basic schooling, he or she would say, yes, but I mean, I know my reindeer. I mean, it's a problem. I know, and it's not only me. I mean, you've got other people here who know that it doesn't really work very well. There are these or that problems, and then of course the group collectively have to make up its mind whether they believe an engineer sitting in Stockholm knows more about reindeer herding than the reindeer herder. But on the other hand, the reindeer herder is not very trustworthy discussing high power transmission systems. So it tends to sort itself out. But when it comes to, let's say, the linkages between different areas of knowledge, those requires the input from the various specialists. And in Namibia, the people who are, let's say, herding goats or sheep or semi-nomadic or whatever, of course they are specialists in their context. It's just a matter of acknowledging. It doesn't make them specialists in highway construction. But I mean, and vice versa, the highway constructing people don't know the impact on herding.
So the crucial role then is essentially really you as mediator of the whole system.
I sometimes have to push them.
Sorry?
I have to push and get people active. But in the end, it's actually they who decide whether or not this activity impacts this activity or feature or another, and whether more of that increases or decreases that. And people will make all sorts of statements, but that it will eventually be pretty clear which linkage makes sense, either from a scientific point of view, and then we as scientists have to go in and say, yes, it's okay, you feel like that, but there's pretty substantial evidence that it's linked the other way. That's basically the only intervention we really do. Otherwise, people have to, you know, actually state how things link up and, as I said, concurrently with other stakeholders, tend to solve it. I have one experience of one individual who wouldn't accept the outcome of the model. Everybody else was convinced that he was wrong. We actually did some special modeling to show him that he was wrong. I think he understood it, but he was the lawyer for the Swedish consortium of municipalities, and he was the one who represented them in these 30% of court cases in all the procurement cases. And of course, he couldn't give out his legal argument position, but I would suspect that he also realized that his argument was actually kept.
Just, I think maybe a final one from my side, because if I just in addition to what Philip is saying, I think a lot of times values can come in as well, where people say, you know, I think also in our community, in our context, we say, no, that's just the way we do it. That's just the way it is. So in kind of a discussion around this, people might not want to read it rationally, but you say, no, that's just the way. Do you have these situations as well, where you just get blocked because of cultural values or values in general?
Our experience is that people get excited about understanding how things work. And then they can have totally different agendas. One wants no exploitation in the mountains, or somebody wants something else. Somebody wants to fill it with wind power or mines or whatever. Those are incompatible outcomes. To some extent, they are based on values. Doesn't solve those value conflicts, but as long as you can understand what's happening, more of A impacts on B this way, and B, on the other hand, also feeds through C back on A. If we can figure that out, that's good enough. Doesn't solve value conflicts. I think we have to embrace that it's perfectly legitimate to have different values and agendas. The whole role of politics and applied planning, which of course includes politics, is actually to make decisions about what do you prioritize and to what extent. And that is a value judgment. But it gives you a better understanding of how things actually work. That's basically all we can promise.
Okay, I would like to thank you very much, and I would like to get another round of applause for this. I would like to close this lecture, and I think there is some drinks, some coffee. Thank you so much. Very good. So we are going to have a picture.
Yes.